All right, I think we can probably go ahead forward. Maybe the other folks will hop on here in a few minutes, but um, for those of you who are here, please help us welcome Ann Shafer. And also, just so you guys know, please feel free to ask questions. We will be answering them at the end of the presentation.
Okay, so I'm just gonna jump in. I hope you, all right, here we go. Let me share my screen. Oh, Jesus. Abigail, I can't share my screen. Technical difficulties, always fun. There we go. Okay, hopefully you all can see that. Abigail, can you see that? Oh
It
no, I have
doesn't
to,
look like
wait,
anything.
hold on. I always forget to hit the share button. All right, how's that?
Perfect.
Okay, good. Shoo. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here. Jim Abbott and I have known each other for a long time, and I'm always happy to jump in and help when he calls. So today, he asked me to talk about something. It was pretty wide open, so I decided to pull together a presentation about one of my favorite periods in American printmaking, the period between 1900 and 1950 or so. So I thought maybe we weren't all print people. I thought I'd start at the top. So here we go. Print is a work on paper produced in multiple impressions, each of which is printed or pulled from an inked surface. The inked surface can be used over and over. That's called the matrix. And matrices can be made of different kinds of materials: wood, metal, linoleum, screen, or stone. Artists make prints to spread imagery to more than one person. By its very nature of multiplicity, it's a democratic medium. I can have one, you can have one, the Lewes Historical Art Museum can have one, the Baltimore Museum of Art can have one, and so on. Further, prints are portable, relatively less expensive than paintings or other works of art. And prints have historically addressed issues like politics and religion. They've been social satire, caricature, institutional critique, and made for propaganda. They are made by artists whose names you know and by artists whose names you don't know. There's a lot of artists you don't know. Today, you will see prints by artists who are women, artists who are Black, artists who come from varying religious and socioeconomic backgrounds. Today, you will see uplifting and pretty images, and you will see difficult and not so pretty images. Today, you'll see etchings, woodcuts, lithographs, and screen prints. Each technique has its own qualities. They're complicated, so I'm not going to go into technique today. It just would take too long. So today, I encourage you to come with me and let the imagery carry you along on our journey. Please don't be afraid of this chart. This is merely here to help us remember how many things happened during the first half of the 20th century and how fast they happened. The 20th century was the most violent in recorded history. It included 2 world wars, the Cold War, the dismantling of colonialism, the invention of the totalitarian state. There were, of course, amazing technological advancements and improvements to all of our lives. But at the same time, the 20th century was marked by the struggle for human rights and the rise of global capitalism. Whereas artists previously had made work for wealthy patrons associated with the church or state, in this period, art became part of a market economy, and art itself came to be a means of personal self-expression. With the decentralization of art patronage and the rise of art for art's sake in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, successive styles of art change with increasing speed, and they fracture into a kaleidoscope of individual artistic practices. So I want to lay out just a smidge of what's going on as we come into the 20th century, and know that there are several tendrils that go through this entire talk. I'm gonna touch on, I think, 11 of them, and you'll see that these tendrils are all running through contemporaneously, parallel to each other. So tendril number 1, commercial illustration. In America, there wasn't really a market for fine art prints until the late 19th century. Prior printed images were commercial illustrations and popular prints of famous monuments, historical events, national parks, the like. Or they were popular images you might find like Currier and Ives, say, or they were printed in large editions, and the names of the artists of these works are mostly lacking. You don't usually find them on the prints themselves. There were also journals and magazines like Harper's Weekly that published wood engravings of important paintings. This painting on the screen by Winslow Homer, Snap the Whip, which is in the Butler Institute of American Art at Youngstown, Ohio. They have a great American collection. It's an image that gave its audience a sense of nostalgia in a rapidly industrializing and changing country. But there's only one of them. Harper's and other publications were widely circulated, and they would publish wood engravings like this one on the lower part, which had the effect of expanding a taste for art among the people. It enabled an art for all. Okay, tendril number 2, the etching revival. So this is Rembrandt van Rijn. He was the Dutch 17th century artist who made amazing paintings, but also an incredible array of etchings. And people loved the etchings because they felt like they could see Rembrandt's hand as he was drawing on the copper plate. He also used varying kinds of inking to affect weather and times of day. He also tried out different kinds of papers. He even printed on vellum. So there was a real rejuvenation of interest in him. Francis Seymour Hayden was an Englishman. He was the champion of the etching revival. He was a surgeon, and he's best known as an amateur etcher who championed original printmaking. They were trying to pull away from the commercial printmaking that we just saw, where nobody was named and it was all anonymous. They were trying to create a market for the fine art print. He was at the heart of the etching revival in Britain and was one of the founders of their Society of Painter Etchers over there. He also happened to be the brother-in-law of James Abbott McNeill Whistler. They shared an etching press in London, and they even collaborated on a series of prints focused on the Thames. He came to America on an 1882 lecture tour, during which he championed the etching revival, no surprise, across the country, and the stops included Philadelphia and Baltimore. There were lots of artists who participated in this so-called etching revival. One of them is Mary Nemo Moran. I wanted to be sure to include women in the story today. She happened to be married to the painter Thomas Moran, who you might know painted beautiful Hudson River School scenes. He was sort of second generation Hudson River School, and also did traveling out to the American West and painted images of Yellowstone, for instance, which are just amazing. Mary Nemo is an accomplished etcher. Her works are beautiful. Interestingly, she was deferential to Thomas. So if somebody came up to her at a show and one of her works was hanging and said, you know, gosh, your work is really wonderful, she would say, yes, thank you, but have you seen the work of my husband? Which points to the question posed by Linda Nochlin in a 1971 article, why are there no great women artists? In which she put forward this idea that, and I agree, that it's not that there aren't great women artists, it's that the systems were not in place to promote them as such and to get them the renown that the men did. They weren't allowed in academies, for instance, till I can't remember when. They were often at home taking care of their families. They were not encouraged in any way to participate in this artistic economy. The etching revival also, in addition to making use of the selective wiping to affect weather, to use special papers, they also used a new concept, which was the limited edition. Prior to this, no one really tracked the number of impressions from a certain matrix, and they created a market for it by limiting the number. So maybe this print was made in 50 impressions, and so that you knew that as it was selling, that maybe you wouldn't get one, and that created a market. The etching revival prints brought the notion of the fine print to the public. They offered an escape from industrialization and urbanization, and even the disillusionment of the Civil War. They were very pleasant. Of course, we have to show Whistler. Here is his etching from the first Venice set from 1880, which he made in Venice itself. He even etched the copper plates in his hotel room in an etching bath, an acid bath, excuse me, which I find crazy. Whistler was held up as the heir of Rembrandt. His images are sketchy, just like Rembrandt's. They show the hand of the artist. You can imagine him making a drawing just like this. And again, he's using the same kind of special wiping of inks, the special papers, and of course, this idea of the limited edition. Oops, excuse me, sorry. Tendril number 3, Japanism, which is French for all things Japan. There was a craze. Japan opened to the West in 1853, and shortly thereafter, a craze for Japanese prints washed over Europe and certainly made its way to the US. And in fact, it was Frank Lloyd Wright, the architect, who was the biggest promoter of Japanese prints in the US. He traveled there many times over the course of his career, and he brought back prints every time he went and sold them as a dealer. He had an exhibition of his collection of Japanese prints at the Art Institute of Chicago in 1905. And over the years, he apparently sold hundreds of Japanese prints to the Metropolitan. So I wanted to show you a classic example of a Japanese print that would have been making the rounds. This is Hokusai from his tour of waterfalls in various provinces. So I hope you can see my cursor. This is the waterfall coming down here, and these people are climbing up this mountainside up to a temple that's at its top. What you see are the hallmarks of Japanese design, which is this flattening of space. The whole atmospheric perspective comes flat up to the surface of the print. And then there's this blocking of color, the high design of the clouds, which I find amazing, and also the cropped framing. But know that this is important, know that these prints are the result of probably 5 blocks in this case, one for each of the colors. So one piece of paper would be inked and printed from the yellow block first, and then the light green block second, and then probably the light blue block, and then the green, and then the dark blue. It was a long process, and there was a huge studio that would make these happen. And they were meant for common consumption. They were not held up as, fine or unusual or exceptional. So one of the early proponents of the Japanism in prints was Mary Cassatt. Cassatt spent her career in Paris, so she's much more French-facing than she is American-facing. But as a woman, I wanted to include her, and also because she took up this idea of the Japanese print so quickly. There was a large exhibition of Japanese prints at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris in the spring of 1890. And immediately she set out to make a series of 10 color etchings in open admiration of the subjects and compositions and technical innovations of the Japanese print. They clearly show the influence of Japanism, but really are more French-facing than American-facing, as I said. But a little known fact about Cassatt, her effect on American museum collections is huge. She was from a well-to-do family, and she convinced a lot of her patrons and family friends to acquire Impressionist paintings from the artists who were working in France at that time, which is why our American museums have such a treasure trove of Impressionist paintings, where France has fewer. Meanwhile, back in America, the color woodcut is taken up by Arthur Wesley Dow. Arthur Wesley Dow, like so many artists in this period, had gone to Paris and had studied there. He was an influential teacher in New York. He taught at the Pratt Art Institute and the Art Students League, and he published several books, which became very important. They put forward his tenet that rather than copying nature, artists should create art through elements of the composition, such as line and mass and color. And Dow had a particular interest in Japanese art. In fact, he was appointed a curator of Japanese art at the MFA in Boston in 1893, which, for an artist is kind of amazing. And there were other artists who made color woodcuts alongside of Dow. This is Edna Boyce Hopkins. She's following Dow's tenets of balancing light and dark and line and color. She spent her summers on Cape Cod and was associated with a group of printmakers making these kinds of color woodcuts out of Provincetown. They're called the Provincetown printmakers. As led by Dow and others, there was a whole group of them that would create work like this. And I love this sort of simple everyday scene of women bathing in off the coast of the Cape on the Atlantic coast, where the waves are quite large. They crash quite heavily. But look at the negative space of that white that's creating the foam of the water. I think it's just amazing. I love this print. And then Blanche Lazelle also is in Provincetown making prints. She's sort of the best known of the group. In addition to the multi-block color printing that was echoing the Japanese method, in Provincetown, they also developed a new method of carving a single block to carry all of the colors at the same time. And they did it by segregating each of the areas of color by carving a line that would remain inkless and print white. So you can see that each of those sections is separated from the next one by a white line, obviously come to be known as the white line woodcut. Tendril number 4, social realism and the Ashcan school. So it's Joseph Pennell who really brings the fine art print into the 20th century in America. He's the bridge from etching revival to social realism. He's a loud spokesman. He's a tireless champion for printmaking. And he was the first to look at the newly popped up New York City skyline as not only picturesque, but also as an emblem of progress and technological advancement. Pennell is from Philadelphia. There's a lot of Philadelphia connections today. He studied under Thomas Eakins at the Pennsylvania Academy, and he considered Whistler a mentor. He made over 1,800 prints in his career, which is a lot. He was in New York by 1904 and made countless images of the changing city, both glorifying its new skyscrapers and its down on the city grittiness. A little known fact about Pennell, he left a substantial collection of Whistler prints to the Library of Congress, which are still there, obviously. Pennell wasn't a member of the Ashcan School, but he leads right into it. So here's John Sloan. He is a member of the Ashcan School. They were a group of painters from Philadelphia under the leadership of an artist named Robert Henry, who unfortunately didn't make any prints. Oh well. But he convinced the crew to move up to New York in 1904. And for our purposes, the group included 2 artists who made prints, John Sloan here and George Bellows, who you'll see in a minute. And as a group, they were reacting against academia and impressionism. They gave up on the romantic city and instead turned to its teeming life of immigrants and workers, seriously far from sublime and much closer to the Ashcan, a name which, by the way, was given to them by a critic. But here with John Sloan's Turning Out the Light, it's from a 10-part series of New York City life from 1905. He is giving you the most mundane of moments in the married life of this couple when she is leaning up out of bed to turn off the light. I mean, it's at the time was shocking and offensive. You can imagine coming off of the pretty etching revival and Japanese prints that this would be a bit shocking. His frankness and candor was remarkable, really. And portraying humanity, this objectively was greeted with serious criticism. But he's giving us a human-scaled picture of New York, and it's a precursor to what's going to come, the machine age and the glorification of all of the buildings and the bridges and all of that. Okay, tendril number 5, the Armory Show. This was a big deal. In 1913, an exhibition was put together and shown at the Armory on Park Avenue and 67th Street in New York. And there were over 1,000 works of art in the show. I forget how many specifically. 2 of the works from the European side. There were European works of art and also American works of art side by side. And the European art brought over the modernism that had been going on in Paris and other places in Europe for a while now. So the two works that threw up the most brouhaha were Henri Matisse's The Blue Nude, which is in at the Baltimore Museum of Art, where Jim and I both worked and became friends, and also Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending the Staircase from Philadelphia. And the reaction was swift. There were many articles in the newspapers and publications that were just horrified by it. And this, to me, is the funniest of them, the rude descending the staircase, rush hour at the subway, which I think is pretty telling. But notice that the immediate response shows up in what? In print. Prints pop up in so many places. And in this case, it reflects the translation of ideas to a mass audience in real time. It's immediate. Not as immediate as the internet, of course, but for that time, it was immediate. This is my best example of pre and post Armory show image making by a single artist. This is John Marin. I think it's pretty clear image-wise. The 1910 image of the cathedral at Chartres is very in the guise of etching revival, even just sort of a straightforward image of the church's facade. And then by 1913, he's portraying the Brooklyn Bridge swaying, which is just fraught with motion and imagination to me. His etchings of the Brooklyn Bridge and the Woolworth Building and other monumental structures no longer evoke the romantic past, but celebrate the dynamism of the new. And Marin applied his special combination of formalism and expressionism to record his emotional response to the world around him. Tendril number 6, the war and European modernism. So the US finally enters World War I in the latter years of it. And there's not, I mean, I think there is a lot of art of it, but in the printmaking world, they're few and far between from American artists. But George Bellows, who was one of our Ashcan School artists who studied under Henry and with Sloan, produced a series called War in 1918. He was better known actually for his boxing paintings and prints of boxers, which was no surprise that he was interested in sports. He had been recruited as a professional baseball player. A little known fact about this set, though, apparently Pennell, who complained about everything, complained about this set because Bellows hadn't seen combat firsthand. But I think we can agree that the power of the image is undeniable. But Pennell himself turns to help the government with the war effort by designing posters for things like the Liberty Bonds effort. Here he's giving us Lady Liberty with her head in the water down at the right there of the island as the city is aflame. Ooh, excuse me. And then you have one of my favorites, John Taylor Arms. His wasps is it's just amazing. So indebted to Japanism for its cropping and its flattened plane, but also European modernism and its form, but also to American realism. And we all know what that is, and we can read it immediately. He was a little bit outside of the norm. He wasn't from Philadelphia. He didn't, study with Henry or anybody. He actually studied law at Princeton, and at some point became disillusioned with it and transferred to MIT to study architecture. And he served as a naval officer in World War I. But after all of that, he seems to have been able to make his living as a printmaker. It's pretty unusual. Most of them were commercial artists alongside making prints for art collecting public. But as we said, Arms studied architecture at MIT, and I think you can see that here. The image on the left is the study for the print on the right, the graphite drawing, which I darkened so that you can see it. It's on tracing paper, so it's very light. So I pulled it into Photoshop and darkened it so we can see it better. to me, it seems so modern and so kind of full of energy. And I just love the form. And I'm fascinated that by the time he gets it onto a matrix and prints it as a color etching, that it becomes downright staid. Turns so realist. It's so funny. Okay, tendril number 7. We're getting there. Social realism back home. Here's a name you should know, Edward Hopper. He was my first art history love, True Confessions. Well known as a painter, as you probably know, but he also made etchings starting in 1920. He was taught how to make etchings by an artist you'll see coming up next, Martin Lewis, and the parallels between them are interesting. Formerly, this one, I think it's one of the best prints from the early part of the century. It's such an odd composition with its horizontality, and the main subject's a group of cows trundling over railroad tracks, seen from behind even, that occupy the lower half of the composition. I mean, what is going on? Only the top of the house rises into the sky, and perhaps we could read into it that Hopper's prevailing theme is of loneliness, and it's personified in that house that is cut off from society by the railroad tracks. Or maybe the cows are the farmer's only link to society. But in the end, there's a bit of Rembrandt in there with that wide open sky, and it's so cinematic. There's so many filmmakers who have looked at Hopper's compositions for inspiration, and I think this one is clearly one of those. And then he also turns his eye to the city and the alone in a crowdness of living in the city. And here you have a young woman riding the L home after work one day. And this is 1921, and women were wearing corsets and skirts down to the floor in 1900. I mean, it's amazing to think about the changes in women's lives at this point, that they were wearing shorter skirts and were living on their own and making their own living as, secretaries and big office buildings in New York City. I mean, it's so amazing. But I love that he's given you just this sort of quiet moment of reverie. And compare that to this one. This is the artist who taught Hopper how to etch, Martin Lewis, who did this fantastic print in 1930 called Shadow Dance. And in it, you see, again, women walking home from their office jobs down one of the canyons of Manhattan as the sun is setting. And the light is creating this diaphanous wafting of their skirts so that you can see their thigh, risque, risque. And it's set up completely for the male gaze. And in fact, the gentleman on the left-hand side of the composition it's a self-portrait of the artist himself. Lewis he's an amazing printmaker. You'll see one more print of his later on. And, like so many others, he made a living as a commercial artist, but boy, did he know how to make etchings. So compare this image of women with these sort of see-through skirts with this image by Isabel Bishop. In her Noon Hour from 1935, she depicts the casual lunchtime conversation between two young women who are liberated briefly from their secretarial or sales desks. And while many 20th century artists captured distinctly American scenes like this, Bishop focuses almost entirely in her career on the fleeting and private exchanges between female office workers. She married pretty well, and he was a doctor, and they moved out to Riverdale, a suburb of New York, right on the tip of the Bronx. But she maintained her studio space down near Union Square on 14th Street and continued to use it until 1984. So the passersby in Union Square were just continually the subjects for her work. Here's the last of the George Bellows works. Remember, he's one of the Ashcan School painters and printmakers who did that scene of the war sniped in 1918 that Pennell took issue with. So Bellows was part of the Ashcan School, as we know, usually doing scenes of the gritty city, but occasionally he went afield. In this case, he was assigned the illustrations to accompany an article for Metropolitan Magazine in 1915 that was to be written by the social activist John Reed. And the subject is Billy Sunday, who for almost 40 years, he toured the nation preaching to huge spellbound audiences in these giant tabernacles. He was a former baseball player and was renowned for his energetic style and lunging at the height of the sermon. This was very usual for him. In January of 1915, Bellows and Reed went down to Philadelphia and attended a revival meeting. And the experience inspired Bellows to make a painting of this scene a year later. And then 6 years later, this lithograph, he kept returning to it, which were both based on the drawings that he made to illustrate Reed's article. But he was probably like Reed, I haven't read the article, should, repelled by Sunday's spellbinding zealotry. Bellows commented a couple years after seeing him that Sunday was, quote, the worst thing that ever happened to America. He is death to imagination, to spirituality, to art. So then what happens to America? Which way do we go? Do we stick with realism or do we embrace modernism and move forward? This is Martin Lewis's beautiful aquatint etching from 1932 called Which Way, which I was honored to be able to acquire for the Baltimore Museum collection back whenever that was, a couple of, I don't know, 5 years ago. He does both the hustle and bustle of the city, but he also does these quiet country moments. And this one is fascinating to me. You know, we're seeing a car. It's the first time we've seen a car in these images, and we're seeing electric lines streaming across the top part of the image in the snow. And the only illumination in the entire the light source is from the car itself. It's the country in such a drastic change from the urban centers. It necessitates a change in a visual approach, I think. And I think it's, for my money, one of the most beautiful, well, it's probably one of the most beautiful works I acquired for the museum. Okay, tendril number 8, The Shining City on a Hill. So as the skyscrapers went up in New York, artists turned to them and pictured them as monuments of American ingenuity and of monumentality. And they likened them to Egyptian pyramids. Sheeler and others like Charles Demuth made a lot of paintings featuring grain elevators and industrial plants and put them up there like they were churches or, ancient monuments. This is the Delmonico building from 1936. Sheeler was a Philadelphia artist, another Philadelphia artist who studied under William Merritt Chase at the Pennsylvania Academy and who made his living as a commercial photographer. And then, trigger finger. This is Louis Lazowick, who was a Russian emigre to the United States. And during his life, he made trips back and forth to Russia and to Europe. So he was well aware of modern trends. But in this work, it feels very realist to me, which just means that as I've come along in this this story, that my eyes are adjusting, right? It's not the realism of the etching revival. It is modern in its way, but it starts looking a little dowdy, weird. I don't know why that is. Lazowick was a key member of the Works Progress Administration print division office in New York, when we'll get to that in a minute. So the Shining City on a Hill, at what cost to the people? So this is Samuel Margulies's Men of Steel from a little bit later, from 1941, in which two gentlemen are bolting together the girders for one of the buildings. And I love this work. At the left, you can see just a smidge of traffic on the street there. And it gives me vertigo every time I see it. It's also one of my favorite prints. There's so many. All right, let's see. So then we drop down to street level. This is a wood engraving by Claire Layton, Bread Line, New York, 1932. This is a wood engraving, probably intended for an illustration for a book of some sort. She wrote many books and also illustrated them. And you can see there's a grid mark forming 6 squares, 2 over 3 over 2 over 3. Never remember how that goes. And which indicates to me that this was pieced together from 6 blocks of wood. With wood engraving, you need a really hard wood to be able to get the fine detail that they get with these. And so it's a crosscut of a log, and you can't get them really big in this type of wood. I forget what kind of wood it is. So she's pieced together 6 squares to be able to get to this 12 by 8 image. Little known fact about Clara Layton, she lived in Baltimore for a time. I'm in Baltimore, so every time Baltimore pops up, I go, whoo. She lived in Baltimore for a time and was friends with H.L. Mencken, who was one of our crabbiest and most sardonic Baltimore Sun writers. And his letters to her apparently are preserved at the Enoch Pratt Free Library, which is our public library here. So we could go over there and check them out. And then we drop further down underground from the heights to the street to the underground. This is Benton Spruance, a Philadelphia artist who did a 4-part series of different times of day of people getting to and from work in the subway system of New York. He was very prolific, made over 500 lithographs, excuse me, in his career, and is a beloved professor in Philadelphia at the Philadelphia College of Art. So now we're moving into the WPA era with the Depression. The WPA was a huge government work program that hired and paid bazillions of people to keep them alive, really. And there was a federal art project under that umbrella. By 1935, the country was fully in the grip of the Depression, and the federal art project under the WPA had a huge impact on America's artists and teachers. The graphic division of the FAP, the Federal Art Project, was formed in August of 1935, and it ran all the way through April of 1943. And in all, in the Federal Art Project, there were 2,566 murals painted in civic buildings across the country. There were 108,099 easel paintings created. There were 17,744 sculptures created. And in the print division, there were 11,285 designs for fine art prints made. And the count for prints indicates unique designs. It doesn't account for the number of impressions. So there weren't, 500 and there were 11,000 impressions of all of those. It was unique designs, 11,000 unique designs. Apparently 25 impressions of each were pulled for the government. They still belong to the government. And if you see them in various museum collections, they're there on long-term loan still to this day. And they also would print 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 for the artist to keep. The New York City Office of Graphic Art was led by Lewes Delaware. Artists were free to create in their own styles, but it was suggested that the work focus on American life, no surprise. European modernism wasn't really encouraged. In addition to the Manhattan office that was under the care of Lewes Delaware, there was an additional office added up in Harlem. This was all in recognition of the Harlem Renaissance, in which many artists were flourishing up in Upper Manhattan, including this gentleman, Charles Alston. He was part of the Harlem Renaissance and was the first Black supervisor for the WPA Federal Art Project Harlem office. He also was a muralist and was cousins with Romare Bearden by marriage. The Beardens and the Alston family, they had migrated together up from, I think it was Charlotte, North Carolina, to New York in 1915, as so many other Southern Black families did. This was the beginning of the Great Migration. The supposed Great Migration should be really called anyway, another topic. Alston went to Columbia and got a master's from the Teachers College and taught young students at the Harlem Community Arts Center, which became the center of the Harlem office for the Federal Art Project. And included among his students was a 10-year-old Jacob Lawrence. And of course, he supplemented his income with commercial illustration, as they all did, and later became the first Black teacher at the Art Students League. I don't know why we don't know more about Alston. I have to dig into him more, because clearly he was connected with everybody. Also working up at the Harlem office was an artist named Norman Lewis. His older brother was a jazz musician, part of the Harlem Renaissance. And so a lot of his prints from this period feature musicians. He also was working at the Community Arts Center in Harlem. And interestingly, in the 1950s, completely left realism behind and turned to abstraction. He was the subject of a large exhibition in 2015 at the Pennsylvania Academy that was curated by Ruth Fine, and he was, I guess you could say, rediscovered. And so now he's one of the most sought after mid-century abstract painters who are Black, which is great for him. Of course, he died in 1979 and didn't see any of those proceeds. Also working up in Harlem was Robert Blackburn. He grew up in Harlem and by age 13 was taking classes at the Harlem Community Arts Center under Charles Alston, the gentleman we saw 2 slides prior. He had a storied career. He also turned to abstraction like Norman Lewis in the 1950s, but he's probably better known for starting a printmaking workshop in 1947, which still exists today as a nonprofit. That was one of the only, or few, I should say, that welcomed Black artists into it. He also was the first printer for the Universal Limited Art Editions, which is the print shop out on Long Island that prints for Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg and all those kinds of artists later. But the Harlem Renaissance isn't the only place where people are making WPA prints. There are offices and sections all over the country, and there's one in Philadelphia also. This is an artist named Dox Thrash, and he was the head of the Philadelphia office for the WPA Federal Art Project. He had enlisted in World War I and had fought. He was in an infantry division known as the Buffalo Soldiers, which was a all-Black regiment. He wasn't physically injured during that time, but certainly had what they called shell shock at the time, now known as PTSD. And by 1937, he joins the Fine Arts Project in Philadelphia. And he develops a technique called carborundum mezzotint, which is how this print was made, which is basically a carborundum grit that was scraped all over the surface of a copper plate, and then you scrape away and burnish down to create smooth areas that won't hold any ink, so that you're working from dark to light. This is Raymond Steth working in that mode. He's also Philadelphia based and studied under Dox, or I guess he was working parallel to Dox Thrash, also served in the war. And little known fact about him, Baltimore related, he established the print program at Morgan State University. Meanwhile, tendril number 11, regionalism and the associated American artists, together with John Stuart Curry and Grant Wood, Thomas Hart Benton was a leading American regionalist painter and printmaker, known for his sympathetic portrayals of everyday life in the United States, especially rural and small town scenes in the Midwest. He had been initially active in the modernist circles of Paris and New York City, later rejected modernism wholesale and abstraction in favor of this mode of naturalism and representational art. He was from Missouri and remained there after this early foray into New York and Paris for the rest of his life. In this image, these are sharecroppers. Benton's print is a somewhat sympathetic portrayal of these sharecroppers who were enmeshed in an abusive system of labor that enlisted former African slaves to work as farm workers in the post-Civil War South. The sharecroppers typically worked the fields of plantation lands in exchange for a portion of the harvest, usually cotton. And though freed from captivity, sharecroppers were routinely exploited by their former masters, who continued to control their land and, by extension, the workers themselves. This was a print that Benton made for the Associated American Artists, which is a fascinating topic that you might want to dive into at some point. The Associated American Artists was a private company. It was working at the same time as the WPA government project, but this was a private enterprise. It sought to promote artists and their work, and at the same time convince everyday Americans that fine art prints had a place in their homes. In 1934, Associated's founder, a man named Reeves Lewis, held a meeting with artists that included Thomas Hart Benton, this guy, Grant Wood, and John Stuart Curry, the company's heavy hitters, as it were. And Lewis proposed that they produce etchings and lithographs that he would print in editions of 250 and sell to the public for $5 a piece. Here's an ad for the Associated American Artists. What? Only $5 for a signed original? It's so great. Incredible, but true. During its 66-year history, the Associated American Artists sold prints through department stores, but it also at some point opened some galleries, including one on Fifth Avenue for a short time. But Lewenthal's marketing breakthrough was in mail order. Every year, the Associated American Artists sent out catalogs that listed the new works for the coming year and profiles of the artists to encourage purchases. And for the artists themselves, many of whom had barely survived the early 30s when their work was deemed a luxury, and those who could have or might have bought it were having difficulty putting food on the table, the company was a salvation for them. The artists received $200 for each work, and which was the equivalent of about $3,500 today. So other artists that worked for the Associated include John Stuart Curry. He was a Kansas artist. And actually the Kansans thought he was too much. They thought he was too sort of unsympathetic to the people in Kansas. But in any case, he also, in addition to Benton, had gone to Paris, knew everything about modernism. It wasn't that they were working in isolation. But they just said, you know, we're going to turn and look at our own country and portray it. He ended up living out most of his career at the University of Wisconsin up in Madison. He was a resident artist of sorts and was there for the remainder of his career. And also Grant Wood. I love this lithograph in the spring from 1939. Also an artist who traveled to Europe 4 times, in fact, from 1922 to 1928, and taught at the University of Iowa School of Art from 1934 to 1941, and sadly died the next year at the age of 51. And then a last Associated American Artists print by Joseph Hirsch, this unbelievably fabulous lithograph called Banquet. Hirsch was a Philadelphia artist and had studied there under Thomas Eakins, as so many did, and then went up to New York and studied under one of the Ashcan School painters, George Lukes. He worked for the Philadelphia WPA, but in the easel painting division, not the print division, and ended up teaching art at the Art Students League in New York from 1967 to 1981. And little known fact, he was blacklisted by Senator McCarthy in 1952. Okay, tendril number 12, we're at the conclusion. I wanted to show these 2 prints to make a point about the tendrils that don't intersect. On the left, there's Alan Lewis, who is a white artist, born in Mobile, Alabama. He also went to Paris, as so many did, studied with Jean-Léon Gérôme at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And he worked alongside Whistler and Pennell and had works accepted into the printmaking section of the Paris Salon with those 2 artists also. And he was back in New York by 1902. and he became a member of Alfred Stieglitz's circle, exhibiting work at Stieglitz's Gallery 291, which had been showing modernist work for several years. But he does continue this line of work in the color woodcut. So we've circled back to the heroic farmer figure, the symbol of American exceptionalism, all to say that the tendrils don't coalesce. Rather, there is this continuing kaleidoscope of styles and forms in print during the first half of the 20th century, which seems appropriate given the variety of ages and classes and races that make up, the people and artists of the United States. But I wanted to compare it to one of my favorite prints of all time, from a little later than little outside of our talk, but I think so wonderfully emblematic. This is by a Black artist, Charles White, The Voice of Jericho from 1958. And it's, as I said, one of my favorite prints. It's large, it's 39 inches by 21. It's Harry Belafonte singing. And this is a print that I used constantly at the Baltimore Museum's study room, where we hosted classes of students from area colleges. And when the students came in and we started talking about this, we would talk about whether the figure was yelling out loud or silently internally silence, or if he was singing, and most of the students weren't quite sure. We talk about the portrayal of the sound and how that was imaged in the print, that it swirls up above him and takes up more than half of the composition. And, even if the students weren't familiar with Harry Belafonte, most of them weren't, the image conveys an immense amount of emotion, and the students seem to get it. So the tendrils are all still there from the beginning of the century, and they've just morphed. Artists are still working in these modes today, in fact. There's no cohesive style governing printmaking in the earliest days of the 20th century, nor is there one today. If anything, without a prevailing academy with a capital A, there are even more tendrils that we didn't cover. But for those of us who like variety, it's tremendously satisfying to feel one is successfully keeping up with it all. It's no easy task. I'm amazed as I put this talk together, how many of the prints look like they could have been made today and address issues we face still as a nation. I believe that artists are uniquely suited to create art that not only pleases the eye, but also challenges the mind. Images can carry deep meaning and evince emotions out of the most cynical person. And the potential for artists to impact lives is endless. Little known fact, I often refer to myself as a print evangelist. I'm always trying to pull people into the print world. And even if they resist, as an art historian, I'm honored to help people understand art a little bit better. And I hope that my passion for it is contagious. All right, I think I'm going to stop sharing, and I think we're going to take a look at the questions, if there are any, in the chat. Abigail, what do you got?
We don't have any questions, but everybody, if you are interested in asking a question, you'll see the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to do so. We are open to questions. Well, I have a question if you don't mind.
I don't mind, sure.
So I was really intrigued by how you were saying that they applied the ink in different textures and styles. What would they have been doing to get the ink wiped on? Like, what would they have been using to make it?
Yeah, well, when you're inking copper plates that are etchings, the images are incised into the copper. So there's little gouges that hold the ink down in. And so you would spread ink across the entire surface of the plate, and then you would wipe away, after you pushed it all down into those little lines, you would wipe away the stuff that sat on the surface. And if you left some of it, you could manipulate it with your palm, or leave a little bit around the edges and not clean it all away. And you could get these different effects of weather and light and all sorts of stuff. And that was basically how they did it.
Okay, great. And then we do have another question. Great. What happens to the plates?
Oh. There's a print person out there. That's a great question. So there are different conventions for canceling the plates. So once artists started making the limited edition, meaning only 25 of a thing were made, there was a convention of canceling the plate so that if somebody ever got a hold of it and reprinted it, it would be clear that it was not part of the original set of 25. Sometimes artists would drill a hole through the plate. Sometimes they would sign it. Matisse would sign his copper plates writing his name forward so that when it was printed, it would print backwards and it would be clear that it was outside of the edition. Sometimes like the wood blocks, they would be flipped over and used for another print. Sometimes they were destroyed. There was, I can think of a number of artists who were working in Paris when the Germans invaded, and they, up and left, and those things got melted down. So, things, and museums, not all museums, but some museums collect plates. I'm a proponent of collecting plates because I think it's great to see the print and the plate that it was pulled from.
All right. That was the only other question. So we'll just hang out for a minute and see if anybody else would have any questions. In the meantime, I will just say thank you so much, Anne, for joining us today. That was amazing to hear about. Personally, I really loved it. I'm sure our audience was pleased as well. And yeah, the Lewes Historical Society thanks you. And
yeah, actually, can I say one more thing about it?
Yeah.
I focused on sort of the American scene-ishness of the prints. There's a whole group of artists who are embracing European modernism, and so there is a whole other talk to be had about American artists doing works that are outside of what I talked about today, especially during World War II, when so many artists came from Europe. European artists came to New York and spent, the years of the war there, hiding out. There was a huge group of them, and they were, continued to make their own work in their own styles. So there's, even more tendrils to talk about.
So I think what you're saying is when we do this again, you're going to be back.
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
Well, I don't think we're going to be getting any more questions then. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you everybody for your participation and for joining us. And hopefully then we'll see you again sometime, Anne.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks.